Thank you for joining us today for our first virtual Three Rivers Venture Fair. We are starting the fair with session number 1, Life Science Ventures Addressing COVID-19. Before we get started, I would like to thank the generous Three Rivers Venture Fair sponsors. We would not be here without them, and especially at this time when things are uncertain, we are very grateful. Their logos will be displayed throughout the various programs that comprise this year's Venture Fair. Moving on to today's event, our program features 3 outstanding experts in the life sciences field. The panel will explore how life science startups are leveraging their technologies to address COVID-19. Our speakers for today are Pete DiComo, Chairman and CEO of A-Lung Technologies Incorporated, Teresa Whalen, CEO of Cytoagens Incorporated, and today's moderator, Larry Miller, Managing Director of Life Sciences at Innovation Works. If you have any questions for our panel during this event, please use the Q&A function and the panel will try to respond to as many as possible. I will now turn the program over to Larry.
Thank you very much, Three Rivers Venture Fair. It's my honor to moderate. I have great respect for the work of the Three Rivers Venture Fair over the years. I've been honored to work as a coach with them and delighted to be the moderator given the other panelists today. My background in healthcare is over 25 years in diagnostic imaging with General Electric, Picker International, and Philips Healthcare, and then a number of years being a distributor for international products brought in to the United States. My current assignment has been 13 years at Innovation Works, and I am now standing up the Alpha Lab Health Life Science Accelerator. All right, it's my pleasure to introduce Teresa Whalen. Even though the topic today is what these companies are doing with COVID, I have known Teresa in her many functions that she does for the early stage life science community. And I have great respect for her current company and the way she's pulled together tremendous number of resources and has leveraged her science not only for other indications, but sees the direct implications for COVID. Teresa, would you give us a few minutes of your background, please?
Sure. My background, I'm a pharmacist by trade, proud alumna of the University of Pittsburgh School of Pharmacy. I spent my early career as a clinical pharmacist right here in Pittsburgh, primarily in the UPMC network of hospitals. So I definitely have a clinical background, and then I pivoted my career. I spent the last 20 years in industry across a variety of sectors. I spent 10 years with Siemens Medical and their healthcare IT division, and then also sort of transferred into startups around robotics, specialty pharmacy, and now drug development. So I'm happy to be here. Thanks, Larry.
Thank you. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Pete DiComo. I call him the father of the early stage life science community. Some people call him the grandfather, but I'm probably older than he is at this point. But again, Pete has done so much more than just address this COVID-19 virus. Pete, could you give us a summary of your background?
Sure, Larry. Thank you for the kind words. I actually started my career here in Pittsburgh as a respiratory therapist many years ago at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, where I worked in critical care medicine. I was on the faculty of the School of Medicine in critical care and taught therapists, nurses, physicians how to use respiratory devices in the treatment of acute respiratory failure. While I was doing that, I was continuing my education, and I also am a proud alumni of the University of Pittsburgh, receiving both my bachelor's and master's degrees there in business. I moved out of the hospital environment and into the for-profit environment, first with a respiratory device company and then with a home drug infusion company focused on rare chronic diseases. And frankly, got tired of the large organization kind of work, even though I did ascend in the ranks and ended up being chief operating officer of a very large division of a publicly traded company. Decided to go out on my own, become an entrepreneur, and that occurred in the early 90s. I've been with a number of companies. without any pre-planning. The last three companies I was with in senior leadership positions were what we call extracorporeal companies, meaning we take blood from the body, we treat it, and we return it back to the body. And the first one was the first FDA cleared liver dialysis technology. From there, I met a co-founder of mine, and we founded Renal Solutions, which was a Pittsburgh-based company that I brought here from the state of Indiana. And fortunately for us, after raising about 40 million in venture capital, we had a very positive exit in late 2007. And frankly, I thought I was finished at that point in time, but you know how they say, they keep pulling you back in, and came over to A-Lung for what was to be a short stint of a couple of years. And now it's been 11 years, and we're still working through the process. And we sometimes joke that A-Lung is the oldest startup company in the city of Pittsburgh, now being 22 years old. Anyway, that's my background and how I got here. Thank you.
Thank you. We're honored to have the experience level that you two folks bring to us. What I'd like to do now is ask you a series of questions. I would like to set the stage by asking you questions on what your company prospects look like pre-COVID, what COVID did to your company prospects, and then what your prospects are post-COVID. So, Teresa, can I start with you? What was your fundraising status outlook pre-COVID?
Sure, Larry. To put it into context, Cytoagents is focused on a condition called cytokine storm, which is an overreaction of our immune system causing overwhelming inflammation. And it's really scientific consensus that that is what's progressing our COVID population from mild to severe illness. But there are many causes of cytokine release syndrome, or cytokine storm as it's known, both infectious and non-infectious. So we have a pipeline of indications that we're looking at where we believe we can be of therapeutic benefit. Initially, the company was focused on treating influenza, which is still a very important public health problem with a significant unmet need. But in the light of COVID, we knew from our science background and our data that we could also be of tremendous benefit in COVID-19. So we quickly reprioritized the pipeline of what we were looking at, making COVID-19 our first, our primary focus in the short term. But that is going to serve as a foundation for our long-term solution across all of these indications. But essentially, to answer your question, by pivoting to COVID-19, we had an overwhelming response from the angel community across the country, but importantly, from almost every group right here in Pittsburgh, including Innovation Works. So we were able to fund our phase 1 clinical trial for COVID-19 through a convertible note and accelerate that trial into the trial. So we were able to do that under an existing convertible note. We oversubscribed that note, and we used that to fund and accelerate our phase 1 trial. And now we're turning our attention to a traditional Series A equity raise that will fund our phase 2 trial, enable us to expand our manufacturing capabilities, and be in a position that when proof of concept is shown and we are getting efficacy results in our phase 2 trial, that we will be in a position to pursue an emergency use authorization and or a traditional fast track pathway with FDA.
Terrific, thanks. Did you have employees that you had to lay off once COVID hit? Pre-COVID, how many employees did you have and how many do you have now?
Our employee count is the same. We are a primarily virtual company. So I'm obviously a full-time employee, and then we have a chief science officer and a chief medical officer that are employees of the company. But then what we do to manage our cash burn and and also have the deepest bench strength possible with expertise. We work with a variety of consulting firms where we can plug in and take out resources as we need them. So resources like toxicologists, statisticians, CMC experts, those resources that you might not need full time, we rely on our consulting firm to plug and play those and remain as capital efficient as possible, so that all of the capital that we raise goes right into the trial, right into our studies that are generating data.
Terrific. Thanks. Pete, same question to you. Pre-COVID, what did your business look like for 2020?
Well, as I said earlier, we're a 22-year-old company. And first of all, let me tell you a little bit of background about the technology. This is basically an artificial lung. The name of the company, A-Lung, actually stands for artificial lung. This was a technology that was conceived at the University of Pittsburgh McGowan Institute for Regenerative Medicine. We didn't invent the artificial lung. They've been around for decades, but what we've designed here is a very simple, safe, and effective artificial lung that focuses on the removal of carbon dioxide from the body, which is a normal byproduct of metabolism. And we focus on that when patients have some form of respiratory failure where they can't get the carbon dioxide out of the body on their own. So we connect directly to the blood on the venous side of the bloodstream, and we pull blood from the body into our artificial lung. We remove the carbon dioxide, we put a little oxygen back into the blood, and we return it to the body. Unfortunately for us, there are no predicate devices in the United States. And when you don't have a predicate device, the regulatory pathway becomes the most complicated regulatory pathway for a medical device, in that it gets classified as a class 3 device, which forces you into a pre-market approval trial, which means a large randomized clinical trial. So pre-COVID, we were doing a large clinical trial in the United Kingdom called the UK REST trial, partially funded by the National Health System in the UK. We were not the sponsor of that trial, but we were the sole technology partner in that trial. And that trial has come to conclusion. It enrolled 412 patients, 204 of which were randomized to our device. We haven't yet seen the results of that trial. And that trial focused on acute respiratory distress syndrome. And as Teresa said, many of those patients with ARDS, as we call it, undergo a cytokine storm. So we're sort of complementary and supplementary to one another when those patients are afflicted with something like that. In the United States, we've been working with the FDA over the last 8 years on a large randomized clinical trial. We finally got what's called investigational device exemption approval by the FDA and started that trial in late 2016, and we were conducting that trial. A very complex and cumbersome trial, to be honest with you, but that's what the FDA forced us into. We had a target of 180 patients, and we were just about halfway through that trial when COVID-19 struck. And as Teresa most likely knows, clinical trial progression was basically halted as a result of COVID-19 because clinical trial research personnel were considered non-essential and were sent home. So all screening associated with that trial and enrollment in that trial basically came to a halt. But you know, I'm one who likes to quote various famous people. You know, Alexander Graham Bell once said, when one door closes, another door opens, and oftentimes we get so fixated on the door that's closed, we don't pay attention to the door that's open. So certainly we needed to make a pivot. And I went to the FDA, and our team went to the FDA, and we petitioned the FDA for emergency use approval for COVID-19. Because COVID-19 manifests itself in an acute respiratory distress syndrome with a cytokine storm. And as you heard in the early days of COVID, these patients were put on ventilators. They were having an extreme cytokine storm. They were undergoing reduced lung compliance, meaning their lungs got stiff. The ventilators had to work extra hard to move volume into the lungs, and that created large or increased pressures from the ventilators to inflate the lungs, which further inflamed the lungs, causing additional cytokine storm. So what we were doing and still are doing in terms of treatment of COVID-19 patients is we remove the carbon dioxide directly from the blood. We allow the clinician to then turn down ventilator volume and ventilator breath frequency. That lowers the associated pressure from the ventilator and prevents what's referred to as ventilator-induced lung injury, or VILI. So we had to pivot. We then got emergency use approval. We've treated 44, although we're small, we've treated 44 COVID patients to date. Treaters have said very positive things about our technology in terms of reducing ventilator-induced lung injury. And we also then went back to the FDA and said, we can't finish this trial and we're dead in the water as a result of COVID-19. We've treated 1,100 patients worldwide, not COVID-19, but total. And the FDA, as an agency, you should really consider an accelerated pathway for us. They then down classified us from a class 3 device to a class 2 device. And we are now proceeding with what's referred to as a de novo 510K. There's still not a substantial equivalent in the market. So we do have to provide safety and clinical data, but we have an abundance of that. And we project that we'll be approved by the FDA mid-2021. Whereas if we had to continue with the PMA class 3 trial, we probably wouldn't have gotten to market until at least mid-2023. So those are the doors that opened for us as we pivoted as a result of COVID-19.
I hate to summarize that by saying that COVID-19 has helped you, Pete, but in some cases, the new environment has changed the opportunities, the open doors. I know that there's also been some help there for you, Teresa, in terms of government initiatives and funding. Can you discuss what the government has done in terms of funding COVID-19 and your participation?
Sure. In May, we, again, as I mentioned, we had previously been focusing on influenza, and we had submitted an SBR direct to phase 2 grant to expand our non-clinical work around the hypercytokinemia. So which cytokines could we expand our panel, and that again supports our foundation. We were awarded that with an incredible score in May, a $1.6 million grant, and that work is ongoing. But in light of the emergency, the government triggered a supplement response, which is somewhat unprecedented. So if you had an open grant award and you could pivot towards COVID, we had the ability to submit an additional $1.6 million grant on top of that particular grant, and we're waiting for the award. As well as we quickly submitted an additional direct to phase 2 grant specific to COVID-19, a $3 million grant. And we have received a score that's even better, almost unprecedented, as if any of you out there know grant scores, it was a 24. And just today I received from NIH that it has progressed, and now the award is considered highly probable. And so we expect that to be awarded virtually any day now. And what that is going to allow us to do, the supplement and the next $3 million award, is look at the non-clinical animal studies for COVID-19. And one of the challenges that the world is having with COVID-19 is coming up with a validated animal model. We have struggled to produce an animal model that reacts similarly to the human population, and especially for cytoagents perspective, producing this overwhelming cytokine storm. But we do now have a model It's a non-human primate model, which is the most expensive kind of animal model in research. But these grants will, once awarded, those will fund our non-human primate grants. We'll be able to do that in parallel to our human trials. And so the data package will come together. Again, this is extremely meaningful to FDA and our negotiations with them as to how we progress through our phase 2 trial and position the company for an emergency use authorization. So we're working with Tulane. It is the primary and highly regarded academic medical center in the country for non-human primate work. That is, in fact, the academic center that NIH is working with as well. Another barrier to companies is that, as you might imagine, Asian green monkeys are in short supply. And so without the endorsement of NIH, your company will not be prioritized into these centers. And so we do, with NIH's backing, have been able to get into the queue with Tulane. And as soon as that grant is awarded, we will begin work on that. The other thing that we're doing on the clinical side, sorry, just briefly, is there are, NIH is running 5 master protocol studies. They're called the ACTIV trial, ACTIV. And they encompass everything from testing vaccines, antivirals, to immunotherapy. And we are collaborating with the clinical active trial to see if we can be slotted into one of the master protocol trials, which for the immunotherapy drugs, our category. And again, that would be extremely meaningful to the company because we would only have to supply the drug, and the cost of the trial itself, there's potential there that it would be covered by NIH.
That sounds very promising. But what I'm concerned about is, even though funding may be available, and Pete, you got the reclassification, are you actually able to do the trials? A lot of the companies that Innovation Works has been affiliated with, their trials had been interrupted. The staff that had been set up to do that work were not deemed essential, and so their trials have stopped. So Pete, are you going to be able to do your new trial protocol? Is that possible? Is that going to be stretched out? You said maybe a year or so until you might get that approval, but is that really feasible?
Yeah, that's a good question, Larry. Under the de novo 510K process, we're not required to do a trial, and the safety data and the clinical efficacy data that we've accumulated to this point, we can use to support the de novo 510K application. Now, the prior trial that we were doing, we do not want to abandon that. But as I said earlier, it was a very difficult trial to execute. We are going back to the FDA with a proposed revision to the trial. One of the major issues with getting patients enrolled in our trial has always been obtaining consent from them or a legal representative. And the reason for that is that it was a 2-arm trial where patients with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease were randomized either to the investigational arm, which was our therapy, or they were randomized to the standard of care. Well, the standard of care for a chronic obstructive pulmonary disease patient is if they fail non-invasive procedures that hopefully reverse their condition, they end up being intubated, meaning they have a breathing tube down the airway. They get sedated, they get restrained to the bed, and then they're attached to a mechanical ventilator. If you know anything about these patients or have had a relative that has gone through that experience, you realize that most likely the next time they come into the hospital with an acute episode, they have a do not intubate order, meaning they don't want that breathing tube, or they have a do not resuscitate order. So when they learn that there's a 50% chance through randomization that they're going to go to the standard of care, they refuse consent. And that really slowed enrollment in our trial. We're going back to the FDA to eliminate randomization, do a matched control. There's significant data in the literature on the standard of care, meaning ventilators. And then it'll be a single arm trial where patients who meet the inclusion-exclusion criteria go directly to the investigational arm, which would be our device. The FDA has not seen our application for revision yet, but they have verbally indicated that they would be receptive to that. So we're optimistic that that will happen. However, to your point, Larry, even in a COVID-19 environment with that protocol revision, it will still be difficult to enroll patients in the trial. With ICUs being full of COVID-19 patients, it makes it almost impossible to get any attention paid to a clinical trial. In addition to that, what we've seen is that chronic obstructive pulmonary disease patients, COPD patients, are frankly staying home, even when they're significantly ill with an acute episode. They don't want to go to the emergency room. They don't want to be admitted, and they don't want to be exposed to COVID-19. They have depressed immune systems, and they don't want to expose themselves to that. So, you know, many of these patients are going through significant episodes of COPD, and frankly, some of them are dying at home as a result of the fact that they don't want to go to the hospital.
So Pete, just real quick, some of your safety data that was collected overseas, right? Some of your international studies, and the FDA is open to that international data that you collected?
Yes, they are. And not only the safety data, but also the efficacy data. And we have done a number of small trials in the European Union. And in addition to that, we had a voluntary registry where we asked treaters to fill out, clinical information forms. We knew that we would need this data at some point in time in the future, and the FDA has been receptive to both the safety and the efficacy data. And then, as I said, we run the 93 patients here in the United States, plus the 44 COVID-19 patients. And over 1,100 treatments worldwide, we have not had one unanticipated serious adverse event associated with our technology. And that's a pretty remarkable record for a new technology coming out of the box.
I agree. Congratulations on that. I know you make a quality machine. And then Teresa, I know that you're doing some trial work internationally. Tell us about that.
We pivoted to do our phase 1 trial for COVID in Australia for a couple of reasons. One, to your point, the equivalent to FDA is called HREC in Australia, and FDA has a long-standing history of accepting data generated under their guidance. But in Australia, there's a couple advantages. One is that you receive 43 cents back on the dollar for all R&D associated trial work, and that's not a tax rebate, that's cash to the company. And so that was extremely meaningful from a capital perspective to us. And secondly, and in addition, equally as important, is that this is a well-run machine in Australia, phase 1 trial work. They are mobilized and able to do this work very quickly. And because we are addressing COVID-19, our partners in Australia have been great to prioritize our work. So as soon as we were in a position to fund the trial, they immediately started it. And they are recruiting as we speak and screening. So I feel that we're extremely well positioned in phase 1 trial, and all of that data will feed our FDA IND submission into phase 2, which we do intend to run in the United States. So that's an additional piece of the regulatory pathway. Our phase 2 trial, we're looking at about 200 patients, and I don't worry about from the standpoint of the research organization that running the trial. That's our problem is more around, to Pete's point, and said a little bit differently, where he struggles with consent. We are constantly evaluating our inclusion and exclusion criteria, because we are learning in real time as the standard of care does continue to evolve. We see a combination therapy as the ultimate solution. So we see in severe illness, patients needing an antiviral, plugging in an immunotherapy, and perhaps using a device like a lung to avoid the additional injury of traditional ventilation. So I see them all coming together and being very synergistic. And we do have synergy data from our flu program. We know that when addressing flu, our non-clinical data shows that we have 60% survival when given our drug alone, but we have 100% survival when combined with the drug Tamiflu, which is the standard of care for influenza as it relates to antivirals. Now, last week, Gilead's antiviral drug remdesivir was approved. The results of the trial were good enough to be approved, but it is not as positive as we would all like. And so we would originally look to combine the standard of care of being remdesivir and our drug to drive a true reduction in mortality. But there's also dexamethasone that's coming at us as a standard of care, and that's an immunotherapy, and it's what we call a sledgehammer to your immune system. And while we might need that sledgehammer in the critically ill patients because the cytokine storm is so far gone that it may take that type of a drug. But when you really look at the data, the hazard ratio in the more moderate illness is not favorable with dexamethasone. But in the absence of anything else, it's going to be given. So we need to manage that because we certainly would not want to layer our drug on top of a drug like dexamethasone. So we are very focused on managing the science in real time and pivoting our trial design to treat patients and get the results that we're looking for, and also being able to analyze the data. So the inclusion and exclusion criteria for us is paramount to our trial design. And we're targeting starting our trial second quarter of 2021 in the COVID population. And so even what we know today will probably be quite different by then. And we're going to just have to be very nimble and manage the standard of care as it evolves.
Thanks. Sorry, Pete, you had a comment?
No, I'm good.
Okay. So it does seem like it's a global approach to healthcare in terms of trial work, data that you can present to the FDA. From my perspective, the FDA sort of goes on a cycle. Sometimes they are a little bit more strict, sometimes they're less strict with respect to international data or trial design. But it sounds like due to COVID, they're open to a good idea. So I have a bit of an off-the-wall question, given that we're in the middle of COVID. Let's suppose there was a cure for COVID tomorrow, and by now and at the end of the year, everybody would never catch COVID again. But you've had products before COVID or approaches before COVID, and hopefully there'll be a product line or approach post-COVID. What does your business look like next year and the year after, assuming that COVID won't be the biggest part of your business? Pete?
It's a good question, Larry. Well, as I said earlier, we're going to continue with the PMA trial that we embarked upon. And if COVID went away, certainly we'd be able to finish that trial much sooner. Concurrent with that, we would still pursue the de novo and be approved to go to market in mid-2021, even without finishing that trial. What the trial does for us, however, is because it's a randomized clinical trial and there's a significant number of patients that need to be run in that trial, it's considered the gold standard. So it would be data that would be statistically validating the safety and efficacy of our device and the therapy that we're offering. So even though we get the de novo, which is sort of like the silver medal in the Olympics, the gold medal is really the randomized clinical trial data. So we will continue to pursue that to broaden our indication and also act as a barrier to entry for others, competitors who may follow us in terms of pursuing this market. You know, I did have a comment on one of Teresa's points, and that is, you know, we've been at this trial here in the United States for almost 3 years now, and it's not atypical to modify inclusion-exclusion criteria with revisions to the protocol along the way as you learn more about you know, the progress of the trial and what is going to be most effective in terms of getting the most appropriate patients enrolled in the trial. This new revision to the trial that we'll propose to the FDA will be revision number 11, if you can believe that. The last four being the most meaningful, but you know, it's not atypical to do that. And so we, as I said earlier, we expect to be in the market in mid-2021. We'll continue our trial concurrent with that. And hopefully in the second half of 2021, we'll be a revenue producing company finally.
Thanks. And Teresa, I know Innovation Works, as a matter of full disclosure, did invest in cytoagents, and we looked at you there. We actually looked at you pre-COVID, that there were indications and clinical approaches that you were addressing pre-COVID. I assume that if COVID went away, you would go back to that fundamental work. What were the other indications you were working on?
Right. So our phase 1 trial is a safety-driven trial in the human population. And so that will be applicable to a pipeline of indications, all of which cause cytokine storm, and they span infectious and non-infectious. So for example, we're already working on vaping-induced lung injury. Again, when we went to Tulane and started speaking to them about the COVID-19 model, they were actually quite excited about our drug. And they said, well, certainly we'll work with you on COVID-19, but we want you to work with us on vaping-induced lung injury. And they're getting ready to publish a paper on vaping-induced lung injury. And what they're finding is that it's the strongest cytokine storm they've ever seen, causing far worse lung injury than cigarette smoking. And so we already have, again, even an additional grant to the ones I mentioned previously and to NIH to do a non-human primate study of vaping-induced lung injury. And so that would be a likely pivot. We also could look, we know that we have potential. We could circle back to influenza. There's a lot of interest from our investor feedback on looking at CAR T-cell therapy. CAR T-cell therapy is used in oncology, and by design, it ramps up our immune system to treat cancer. But roughly 90% of patients receiving CAR T-cell therapy have an overwhelming cytokine release syndrome and all the illness that comes with that. And so it is quite likely that we could be used as adjuvant therapy along with CAR T-cell therapy. There's a real unmet need in that area. There are some treatments, but they either have an impact, they render the CAR T-cell therapy ineffective, or they themselves have poor safety profiles and they're very expensive, typically biologicals. We're a small molecule alternative. So our manufacturing has been established. We will be entering the market at a much lower price point. It's orally given, it's stable on the shelf, it does not require refrigeration. So importantly, we see we will be positioning ourselves as a stockpiling candidate. So those are a few other indications that we could pursue, span really any infectious disease, as well as ones that are typically autoimmune in nature, juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. And also there's a lot of literature out there about cytokine storm with traumatic brain injury. So we have a lot of flexibility in how we pivot depending on where the disease, the COVID-19 takes us.
Great. Question from the audience. The attendee says, I'm very interested in the use of both Pete's device and Teresa's drug in treating cytokine storms related to other autoimmune diseases like ulcerative colitis and Crohn's. Do either of you see application of your device for those autoimmune diseases?
I'll just comment. We've not treated anyone. We've treated patients with autoimmune diseases, but we've not treated a patient yet with ulcerative colitis or Crohn's. I would predict in the future that you'll probably see our device being used in conjunction with Teresa's product as well. A point that Teresa made earlier, we're not a cure. We're a bridge to recovery. And what we do is we buy time, if you will, for the treating physician to treat these disorders and concurrently treat these patients medically to hopefully bridge them back to recovery. So any patient with any disease where the lungs are compromised and the patient cannot, for whatever reason, remove enough carbon dioxide, or where the ventilator is producing extremely high pressures and further causing lung damage and inflammation and furthering the cytokine storm, we would be an applicable therapy to that.
Teresa?
Our initial science points us to indications more of a neurological nature versus autoimmune diseases of the gut. They do have different pathologies, and it's really all about studying our mechanism of action and how it overlays with the pathology of the disease. So we see more relevance in the neurological disorders, like potentially multiple sclerosis and traumatic brain injury, more than we would necessarily see in Crohn's and or ulcerative colitis. But that's our preliminary thought.
Very good, thanks. Another question. The attendee says, I would love to see these therapies paired with respiratory microbiome analysis. Any work being done there?
Not to my knowledge. We haven't studied that. That doesn't say that in our clinical research and collaboration with key opinion leaders around the world that they haven't studied that. But to my knowledge, if they have, they haven't shared it with us.
Teresa?
We are looking at biomarkers. So there's a lot of published data in COVID-19 that very specific biomarkers. For example, we're looking at more than a dozen of them, but I'll give you one example. D-dimer is a lab test and a biomarker that seems to be driving outcomes in the COVID-19 population, and specifically around these coagulation clotting disorders that patients are having. And so we're looking at lab biomarkers. We have not yet incorporated microbiome type markers, but certainly wouldn't rule it out.
Very good. Thanks, folks. I really appreciate your input. I would like to give you a minute or two each to say what has been your learnings or your takeaways from pre-COVID to COVID looking forward. If you could say what I've learned or what advice you could give to our attendees today, what you've learned over this COVID environment period. Teresa?
I think what we've learned as a the world has learned that our lives can change overnight, and we need to be in a position to adjust to that at all times. Before COVID, the World Health Organization, it was one of their top 5 concerns, a global pandemic. And even if COVID goes away, that's not to say there aren't other pandemic threats moving forward. And I think we all need to take stock of that. And, historically, there's been very little funding put into this type of concern because it is hard to monetize returns from an investor standpoint. But obviously, it's an incredible area of need. And just because COVID goes away, it does not mean that there's still not global pandemic threats out there.
Thank you, Pete.
I would agree with Teresa. Having been with A-Lung for 10 years now, more than 10 years actually, part of our pitch has been respiratory disease, ventilatory failure will be a pandemic and epidemic proportions worldwide. And when you're out there raising money and you're pitching that every day, it can be frustrating when the audience is not receiving that message and understanding that message. COVID-19 is an example of all of a sudden our society waking up and realizing that these things can happen. And now we receive much more interest and much more attention from the investment community. But if there's any message that I would send, and I think I've already stated it, and that is, in the startup world especially, there are challenges presented to these types of companies every day. I think if we told our investors every challenge that was put in front of us every day, we would certainly scare them off. But COVID-19 is only an example of a major challenge that's been put in front of us. But good teams problem solve, they become creative, they work around those challenges, and they keep the company moving forward. So don't let that door that's closing scare you. Always look for the opportunity that closed door presents.
Amen. Thank you very much, Pete and Teresa. Extremely great words of wisdom and how you approached COVID. And I want to thank you personally for your contribution to the early stage life science ecosystem. You've both been extremely generous with your time and have been major contributors to Pittsburgh's, I think, rise in the nation's view as a center for life science. So I really appreciate the time that you have given us today. And I would also like to thank the sponsors for making Three Rivers Venture Fair possible and this session. So thank you all for attending today. I do want to remind you that at 1 p.m. the Venture Connection begins. Venture Connection is only open to pre-registered selected entrepreneurs and pre-registered investors. At 2:30, we'll have a general session for all to attend. It's a panel discussion on marijuana, CBD, and hemp highs and lows, fits and starts. We hope you will join us. And once again, thank you again for joining today's session.
Thank you, Larry.
Thank you.